There we go. The Articles of Confederation are flawed. That's kind of where we left off, and talking about what it was that triggered the people we call our founding fathers to believe that we needed to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and create a new constitution. And we were kind of left off in talking about what they would respond to was Shays' Rebellion. You saw that Mr. Betts kind of, mentioned Shays' Rebellion in there. Daniel Shays is usually comes up in our history textbooks as the guy who ticks off George Washington, the guy who convinces Washington and Madison and others that we need we need a stronger government. What we've been trying to do is figure out who exactly is Daniel Shays, other than the guy who ticks off George Washington, right? There's more than one way to understand an individual. And what I argued at the end of last lecture was to understand Daniel Shays, we needed to step back into the 1760s, into North Carolina, and to study the regulator movement. So that's kind of where we left off in talking about this farmer revolt that took place in North Carolina in the 1760s. Ultimately, by the time of the American Revolution in 1776, the North Carolina regulation is over. But the conditions that led to that movement are only spreading throughout the colonies. And so we turn our attention today, again, to try to understand why we get a new constitution out of the Articles of Confederation. We need to understand these farmer movements. So we turn our attention now to 1780s in Massachusetts. What's going on in Massachusetts in the 1780s? The same thing that was going on in North Carolina in the 1760s. Farmers were asked to pay taxes, can't pay their taxes because they don't have silver and gold to pay their taxes. And so their property is being taken away from them. Foreclosure rates are skyrocketing throughout the colonies in the 1780s. I believe in Pennsylvania between 1782 and 1784, foreclosures on farm property shot up 50%. Farmers are losing their livelihoods, their property left and right in the 1780s. So it's exactly the same kind of thing that was going on in North Carolina in the 1760s, with a couple of differences, a couple of significant differences. In the 1760s, who was doing the taxing? The British, right? Particularly the royal governor, William Tryon in North Carolina. Who's doing the taxing in the 1780s? Who's taxing these farmers in Western Massachusetts in the 1780s? It's not the king. They're not under the king anymore. That whole, Declaration of Independence thing. It's the colonists taxing other colonists. So farmers are losing their property in Western Massachusetts in the 1780s because of tax policies now, not that are imposed upon them by the king, but by fellow colonists. There's another difference too. Who are these people who are getting taxed? They're more than simply farmers. They're also war vets. These are people who fought or were fighting in the Continental Army alongside George Washington, making the revolution possible. These were the guys who were rowing that boat across the Delaware. And they're out there fighting for independence, fighting for a better life. They hope for their family, and they're getting word from back home. The sheriff's about to foreclose on their property. It's exactly the same conditions. Farmers are being asked to pay taxes. They're being asked to pay taxes in silver and gold. There is no silver and gold. Silver and gold is concentrated in cities. It's not circulating throughout farm populations. Farmers, it's not that farmers don't want to pay their taxes. They want to pay their taxes the way that they always pay taxes, through printing paper money. In this case, the colonists, the new governments still are insisting that taxes being paid in silver and gold. And it has to do with who then the governments need to pay in silver and gold and what have you. So it's exactly the same kind of thing that was going on in North Carolina in the 1760s, except now it's colonists taxing colonists, and it's colonists taxing war vets. People who are fighting for the independence of America are losing their property. Now, it's true, these farmers did receive a kind of pension or payment from the government when they signed up. They were promised $10. But under the Articles of Confederation, which doesn't have tax power, how could the new federal government pay its debts? And the answer is it couldn't. And so war vets, instead of getting paid their $10, they got these little IOUs, these war bonds, saying, "Hey, thank you for your service. Eventually, you hold on to this. Eventually, we will pay you back." But a government doesn't have the power to tax. How is that government possibly going to pay off these war bonds? The answer is probably not. And so while these farmers are waiting for their back pay from the federal government that they had served in fighting for independence, they're losing their property. Who is Daniel Shays? Besides the guy who kicked off George Washington, who is Daniel Shays? He's a farmer in Western Massachusetts and a war vet whose property is being threatened. But before Shays' rebellion, we need to talk about Ellie's rebellion. Samuel Ellie's rebellion in 1782. Before Daniel Shays did his thing, as I said, these kind of farmer movements, because the conditions don't change, because they're spreading during these years, these farmer movements keep arising. Ellie's rebellion, led by Samuel Ellie. Ellie was a pastor. Ellie had been a pastor in Connecticut. He got kicked out for preaching sermons against the wealthy. Finds his way to Western Massachusetts and perceives what he believes to be a great injustice. Here are people who are just trying to, it's not like they're trying to get out of like paying their taxes. They want to pay their taxes. They have no means to be able to do so. Not only that, but a lot of these guys are war vets. They fought for the independence of their country. And what is their reward? The loss of their way of life, the loss of their property. And Ellie is saying, this is unconscionable. How could the American Revolution, how could the war for independence mean our lives are worse off than before? And so Ellie mobilizes farmers to march on the Supreme Courthouse in Massachusetts to shut it down so they can stop these foreclosure proceedings. Ellie was heard to have said, we're going to knock their gray wigs off and take them out of this world in an instant. Gray wigs, that symbol of aristocracy, of urban wealth. These farmers under this Pastor Ellie are mobilizing against it. Now, why do we not talk about Ellie's rebellion in high school? Why do we talk about Shays' rebellion? Because Ellie's rebellion ultimately breaks up pretty easily. The same like with the regulators at Alamance. Ellie's rebellion is put down pretty quickly too. Ellie, I think, is arrested and then he's like shipped off to another colony. I forget where he ends up. But and so Ellie's rebellion is put down in 1782, but the conditions don't change. It's the same thing. Farmers are being asked to pay taxes. They're being asked to pay taxes in silver and gold. They can't pay taxes in silver and gold. And so their property is being foreclosed upon. This continues as we move into the 1780s. Look, things get so bad in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts in the 1780s, that people take to the streets. They go out to the communities and they begin marching, chanting, "Bring back King George. Bring back King George." This is how horrible conditions are for farmers in almost all of the colonies, in this case in Massachusetts. They're saying the revolution, from our standpoint, was meaningless. We are worse off than before. At least under George, we could still have a farm, make a living. Is this what independence means? Independence means the destruction of our way of life. And so Elliott's Rebellion was put down. These kind of street protests don't go anyplace, but the conditions don't change. When you don't address the underlying conditions, eventually you get more revolutionary movements. And that's what you get in 1786 and 1787 with Shays' Rebellion. So my point, and I'm not going to go into the details of Shays' Rebellion, you can get that from Maclay's book. We have to understand some things about Daniel Shays, though. One, this is not some kind of isolated movement of grievance, right? This is these farmer revolts had been happening for decades. They had been a long time coming in places like Massachusetts. It's because these individuals, these Americans, were finding themselves in positions where they literally could not continue their way of life, right? It's not that they didn't want to pay their taxes. It's not that they were disloyal in some kind of way, but literally the conditions were such that they could not legitimately pay their taxes. They complained to the government, please print paper money so we can trade some chickens and cows in and pay our public debts. And the government's not listening. This had happened in North Carolina in the 1760s, and it led to an armed regulator uprising. It's happening again in the 1780s in Massachusetts, but a little bit different now. The governor in Massachusetts is not a royal governor in the 1780s. Guess who the governor of Massachusetts is, who's not listening to these farmers? Remember good old Sam Adams, where we began this series of lectures with? Remember Sam Adams, the prodigal son, who was taking on Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, fighting for the rights of the poor of Boston, trying to defend the town meeting tradition. Sam Adams, one of the first great revolutionaries, now finds himself governor of Massachusetts, and guess what? From the standpoint of Daniel Shays, Sam Adams is the new King George. He's imposing an oppressive tax system on us. He's unresponsive to our pleas for help. And Shays and fellow war vet farmers say enough of this. And from their standpoint, they are restarting the American Revolution. What was the American Revolution, after all? It was a movement against an oppressive tax system and an unresponsive government. What are Daniel Shays and his fellow farmers taking on? An oppressive tax system and an unresponsive government. So who is Daniel Shays? The guy who kicks off George Washington? Sure. But he's also the American revolutionary who's continuing the spirit of 1776, now having to fight against his own government, but for exactly the same reasons that he had fought against England before. These farmers find themselves in conditions almost identical to what they had initially revolted against in the 1770s. Now in the 1780s, they find their way of life threatened, outright destroyed. And they're not having it. Big surprise that people who took up arms against an oppressive tax system and unresponsive government in the 1770s, big surprise that they would do the same thing in the 1780s. Right? They're just doing 10 years later what they had done 10 years before. So if Daniel Shays is in fact the revolutionary, What does that make George Washington? What does it make George Washington, who's freaked out by Daniel Shays and Shays Rebellion? Again, you can get the facts, details, the numbers from McClay's book. I'm trying to present kind of the big picture here. If Shays is the revolutionary, then who is George Washington? Who are the people who gather in Philadelphia in 1787 to create a stronger government to make sure that future Shays rebellions can't take place? If Shays is the revolutionary, then who is George Washington? George Washington is the counter-revolutionary. George Washington and the people who gather in Philadelphia in 1787 to write up a new government, believing the Articles of Confederation were flawed to an extent that they needed to be completely thrown out. The breaking, and a number of different things led them to that conclusion, but the breaking point was ultimately Shays Rebellion and how it freaked them out. You saw from that previous slide, George Washington writing to James Madison says, look, Shays Rebellion means nothing less than we've had too optimistic a view of human nature. Obviously, our people can't govern themselves. They've been given too much liberty. Your Daniel Shays, the problem with the Daniel Shays, they had too much freedom. They had too much liberty. We need a stronger government that can hold their base instincts in check. That's Washington's perspective. This is a perspective that usually appears in our textbooks. As I try to do throughout this class, we have to understand there's more than one side to every story. We need to understand the story of the writing of our Constitution, not from the standpoint simply of George Washington, but from the standpoint of Daniel Shays and the regulators. Who were these guys? They were guys who were trying to preserve their way of life against an oppressive tax system and an unresponsive government, now composed of their own people. Here's a problem that we have in understanding this period, is that we just quickly move from 1776 to 1787, completely ignore what's going on during those years. And so we get the story of our founding completely wrong. We assume that we had a revolution in 1776, and then we developed a new constitution to institute that revolution 10 years later. We think that the US Constitution is about liberty. The US Constitution is not about liberty. How does that preamble to the US Constitution begin? We the people, in order to establish a free country? No, to make a more perfect union. Look, the people who write up the Constitution changed their minds over those 10 years. The very people who were crying liberty, liberty, liberty in 1776, by 1786 are crying order, order, order. We need to understand the people we call our founding fathers, they changed their minds in the 1780s, and different things led them to change their minds. But one of the big things that led them to change their mind was these regulator movements. The rising of these farmer movements led the people we call our founding fathers to create a stronger central government, which would limit the freedoms of Americans going forward. People who call our founding fathers were revolutionaries in the 1770s. They were counter-revolutionaries in the 1780s. We can't understand American history going forward. We can't understand our conflicts today unless we understand that America is founded as a conflict between freedom and order, right? You know, and in some cases, it wasn't even different people. Right? It wasn't different people in the 1780s saying we need to move in a different direction. It was the same people. It was the George Washingtons and James Madisons who had been crying liberty in the 1770s and the 1780s, or crying order. We need a stronger central government to put a check on your Daniel Shays. And so I think we get this period of history wrong if we think that somehow the US Constitution is intended to enshrine the values of the American Revolution. No, the Articles of Confederation enshrined the values of the American Revolution. It was limited government for a people who were fighting for their freedom against a tyrannical government. Many of the people who fought in the revolution looked at the new US Constitution as a new tyranny. I think you've already kind of read about this, right? The U.S. and I know a number of you noted it in your papers on Maclay. You were surprised at how indifferent, ambivalent, even opposed Americans were to this new Constitution, right? Could they not see that this would create the best Constitution the world has ever known at that time? No, they didn't see that. What they saw was a group of people who threw out the government that they had created to preserve their liberties, and without trying to create a stronger central government, which they believed would be used to oppress them. Most Americans were not excited about this new Constitution. Nevertheless, people we call our founding fathers believed, especially looking at regulator movements, they believed it was necessary to create a stronger central government, again, to provide checks on the liberties that had been secured in the American Revolution. Again, we have to understand that this period of history, we look back at it as like a golden age, right? We look at our present day conflicts and they say, oh, if we could just get back to, the time in which Americans didn't have these kinds of conflicts. When our leaders all confidently knew what this, there is no golden age in American history, right? There is no perfect time in which there's not conflict. There is no time in which our leaders are not wondering what's the best way forward. There's no time in which popular movements are not helping to shape the political culture of the United States. It's always been that way. And so the messiness of today is the messiness of the 1780s and the 1790s. All right. And I think that we just, it should help us better understand our present or appreciate our present when we understand that this is nothing new. This is exactly what Americans have been going through since our very beginnings. I don't call the Constitution writers counter-revolutionaries to or highlight the way that they're trying to check American liberties, to put Daniel Shays in their place. I don't say this to their disrespect. Look, when people, when leaders change their minds, when they realize, hey, something that worked 10 years before isn't working now. We need to move in a different direction. When they have the courage to do that, I have great respect for them. But I do have to understand who they are, right? The people who wrote the Constitution were not trying to institute the spirit of 1776. They were trying to check it. The spirit of 1776 was Daniel Shays. George Washington was trying to put Daniel Shays in his place, trying to make sure that a Daniel Shays could not arise in the future, and a stronger central government would provide that check on American liberties. We need to understand who our founding fathers were. They were revolutionaries in the 1770s, but many of them became counter-revolutionaries in the 1780s, particularly three: George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. I want to say a little bit about this before we kind of move forward. Because the new Constitution was so unpopular, people who were for the Constitution, they became known as the Federalists. If you remember from the play, that becomes kind of our, the name of one of our first political parties, the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton. that name comes from the Federalist Papers, right? Once they wrote the Constitution up, Madison, Hamilton, and this guy John Jay realized we needed to try to explain this Constitution. We also need to kind of market this Constitution as well, too. Madison was probably the most important of the Federalist Paper writers. Madison, as you know from the play, did more than anyone else to kind of shape our U.S. Constitution. He is often called the father of the Constitution. And his Federalist Paper number 10, which I sent you, and you can read on your own, is truly a masterpiece of American political thought. Look, the very phrase masterpiece of American political thought is a bit of a misnomer. Americans are not known for great political thought. We're not known for great thought. That's not what Americans excel at. We excel at making things. We make machines. We make pretty cool movies and TV shows. We don't think great. James Madison's Federalist Paper number 10 is one of the exceptions there. So you can read that on your own, but a few things I wanted to highlight for why Madison says we need a new constitution, or kind of outline his vision for the future. One is, you can see, I'll point out three things. One, the first there, you see Madison and the founders imagining us establishing a republic, not a democracy. So how is it that we come to understand the United States as a democracy? We will get there, right? But it's going to come in the third section of this course. How we get there. It's not there, certainly not in 1788, when Federalist Paper number 10 is being written up, right? They imagine they're establishing a republic, but not any kind of republic. As Madison explains there, we're establishing a large republic. And this, I want to highlight this because it goes back to something we talked about before. The people we call our founding fathers, their vision of the future of North America was one of expansion west, right? They didn't think that Americans could stay within a narrow bounds. They had to be able to move west because of overpopulation, more land resources, what have you. So it was an expanding vision. So when they wrote up a new constitution, they had to have a vision of an expanding republic. And so Madison says, look, not only are we going to have a Republican form of government here in North America under this Constitution, but it has to be an expanding republic. And this is one of his great innovations to world political thought. There had been republics before ours, but they had been small. Like going back to the Greeks and Romans, the Italians in the 1500s. There had been republics, but they had been small. The conventional wisdom was republics only last on a small scale. Republics only last when there's small numbers and they cover a small area. Madison blows that wisdom up. Says it's actually not true. You want a stable republic, it's got to be an expanding. Got to be an expanding republic. This goes to his theory of faction. You'll read about that and see if you can kind of follow his logic. Right? What is it that ultimately destroys countries, communities, is factions, interest groups? So, most of his Federalist Paper number 10 is trying to answer the question, well, what do we do with factions? One theory would be to stop them from forming. But how do you stop factions from forming? Well, don't you have to take away their liberties? Look, we have countries in the world today that don't have factions. North Korea, for instance. North Korea doesn't have factions. And anyone want the United States to become North Korea? No, as Madison says, the cure is worse than the disease, right? The price of freedom is faction. If you give people freedom, they're going to form factions. And those factions are going to have the potential of tearing your society apart. But the alternative, denying people freedom of assembly, of free speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, would be worse. So we had to live with factions. Here's Madison's innovation. The best way to live with factions, the best way to control factions is just to run with them. Just let them form. And this is why a large republic is better than a small republic. In a large republic, well, he says there, it will not be denied to represent, does it consist, meaning a large republic as opposed to a small, does it consist in a greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties, he means factions, he doesn't mean political parties, against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest. In equal degree, does the increased variety of parties comprised within a union increase this security? The more people you have, the larger republic, the more people you have. The more people you have, the more factions you have. We actually want more factions. Why do we want more factions? They'll check and balance each other. They'll fight each other. Government doesn't have to spend a lot of time controlling the factions will fight it out. He uses religion and religious groups. Madison seems to make an argument for why religious diversity, religious pluralism is actually good for social order. You know, it kind of flies in the face of even common sense. We would think, well, doesn't more Christian denominations, doesn't it lead to more conflict? I think Madison would say, yes, it does. But if Baptists are fighting Methodists, and Methodists are fighting Presbyterians, and Presbyterians are fighting Episcopalians, what is no one doing? What are none of those groups doing? What's that? None of them is dominating. And how do religious groups, all religious groups ultimately aim at what? Taking over the state, right? So as long as Methodists have to fight Baptists and Baptists have to fight Presbyterians and Presbyterians have to fight Congregationalists, they're not able to take over the government. They're not able, no faction can take over the government. The worst thing that could happen would be for a faction to take over control of the government and then use the state to then enforce its interests on other people outside of it. We want more factions. Yes, more factions is going to mean more conflict, but that conflict means that no group can take control of the government and then impose its minority views on the majority of the country. It's a fascinating argument, and he's the first one to make it. He said the conventional thinking was republics only work on a small scale. Madison says no. We need a larger territory. We need more people. We need more factions. As we have more factions, it's going to make it less likely that any one faction can take control of the government. I'll leave it to you to decide if Madison is proved prophetic or not. He believed that this Constitution would kind of be able to play umpire over this increasing factionalism of Americans. Let Americans expand, let them move west, let the number of factions increase. As they do, I mean, we need a government that can step in at times and, you know, maybe curb some of the excesses of certain factions, or if one faction seems to gain domination over another, then maybe you need government in there to try to reestablish an equal playing field. But for the most part, let factions play themselves out. And the thought was Americans would remain free as the number of factions increase. Has Madison's view of history proven right? Has America become a place of greater conflict, not less conflict, since the 1780s and 1790s? But have we also become a place of greater freedom? Or is Madison wrong and we do have factions that have control over the government? We do have, maybe in some instances, where factions, maybe Baptists have not been able to take over the federal government and impose their will on the rest of us. Maybe some other factions have. I'll leave that for you to decide. The final thing I'll point out, just because it brings this otherwise transcendent document back down to earth and back down to history. Madison's Federalist Paper number 10, it really is just worth the time to take to and read it. It's one of those rare great contributions that Americans have made to political thought. But who is Madison talking about here? It's kind of his last paragraph. He talks about religion first, but then he kind of goes a little bit weird here. Who is he talking about? A rage for paper money, for abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. Rage for paper money, abolition of debts, equal division of property. Who's Madison talking about that? We need this new constitution to create this new society. It's a society in which a rage for paper money, for abolition of debts, for equal division of property, this stuff can be contained. Who's he talking about? Who has a rage for paper money or abolition of debts? What's that? Yeah, absolutely. He's talking about Daniel Shays, right? I mean, this is another evidence that why do the people we call our founding fathers, why did they get wiggy with it in 1786? Why did they create a stronger central government when the Articles of Confederation clearly reflected their earlier views? Why did they create this stronger central government? There's a lot of reasons, but the final straw was the regulator movements, in this case, Shays Rebellion, or Shays Regulation, whatever you want to call it, right? I mean, they are all these farmer revolts are all of the same piece, right? They are all working from the same conditions. But in this particular case, this class conflict, in this case, farmer uprisings against these attempts to destroy their way of life, leads to a stronger central government, leads to a US Constitution. So I've made the claim before that class conflict shaped the decision for independence. I'm also suggesting that class conflict created the conditions that led to our new US Constitution. That we need to understand conflicts between the colonists themselves to understand how some of these major political developments came about. Our decision for independence from England, and in this case, the creation of a new US Constitution, were shaped by or were intended to, in some ways, resolve conflicts between the colonists themselves. So this dual revolution is continuing even after the American Revolution. One final thing before I move on. I don't think Madison's playing fair. A rage for paper money, well, yes, it's true that the regulators in the 1760s, Daniel Shays in the 1780s, they want their governments to print paper money. After Shays' Rebellion, the government gets kind of funky. After Shays' Rebellion, it does start allowing farmers to pay their debts with like produce and stuff. So I have these pictures of like farmers walking cows into courthouses to to pay their debt. So they provide some kind of relief. I mean, there's some recognition that, you know, the farmers, they want to pay their debts. We're just not giving them any way to do so. There's some recognition there, but here's Madison coming along saying, rage for paper money. Like, well, it's true. Shays and other farmers, they did want governments to go back to printing paper money so that they could trade in their produce, trade in their livestock, and pay their public debts. An abolition of debts? In some cases, yes. In some cases, farmers were asking for just to cancel public debts. In other cases, they wanted to pay their taxes. They just couldn't. I think Madison's kind of fibbing on both of these first two. He's exaggerating a little bit. But man, he goes full Red Scare. Madison's kind of the first red baiter. Even before communism is even on the world scene, Madison is there. These farmers, they want an equal distribution of property. They're a bunch of communists. There's no advocacy on the part of the regulators for any kind of communism or equal distribution of property. That's not what they were about. These farmers had no problem with persons of wealth having wealth. They had a big problem with persons of wealth having more exclusive or privileged access to government, or government that worked on behalf of the wealthy and not on behalf of all of the people. They had a big problem with that. They did not, however, as Madison is suggesting here, as I said, Madison's just full on stereotyping the regulators at this point. This is not what they were about. But, you know, Madison, he's exaggerating because he's trying to get this thing through. So what's the big point? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. For many Americans, they fought a revolution against tyrannical, unresponsive political power. They found themselves 10 years later fighting tyrannical, unresponsive political power, now being exercised by Americans themselves. And they were worried that if this new US Constitution got through, it would essentially be recreating a kind of monarchy or monarchical kind of centralized power in America itself. And this new government was going to be used to oppress Americans in the same way that King George had oppressed Americans from afar. This new government under this new US Constitution, a much stronger government than the Articles of Confederation, would be used to oppress the people on their own shores. You know this. You read about this in Maclay. This is why the anti-federalist movement was stronger or larger. I would say stronger, but it's larger than the Federalist movement. The people who opposed the ratification of this new Constitution were larger in numbers than those who were for it. The only thing that allowed this Constitution to get through is that a majority of Americans couldn't vote for it. They didn't have the ability to vote for it because they didn't have enough property or whatever, but overwhelmingly, the Americans feared that this new government would be oppressive and tyrannical, and most did not want to see it passed, but they didn't have any way to stop it. And so meet the new boss, same as the old boss. President George Washington. Is he now King George on our own shores? Many Americans worried about that. Now, enough anti-federalists flipped over because of the whole Bill of Rights thing. And that's Maclay stuff, right? The Bill of Rights, the First Amendment to the Constitution. When we think of the Constitution as guaranteeing our freedoms or what have you, that doesn't come about, the Bill of Rights doesn't come about because Washington and Madison, it comes about because of the Anti-Federalists. Because it comes about because of pressure from your Daniel Shays types who are saying, look, this government kind of freaks us out. Could you spell out our liberties for us a little bit? And reluctantly, Madison and Hamilton said, okay, sure. But we have to understand, I think, how our politics originated or formed. It's always been an interplay between elites and popular movements. We're much more likely today to want to discourage or suspect popular movements. I think when we do so, we don't understand how our own Constitution came to be. The US Constitution came about because of elite fears of popular uprisings, but the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, came exactly because of that popular pressure. And so, look, if we have popular movements today putting pressure on the political system to try to change, that's not anything new. That's what Americans have always done. That's how Americans have always tried to express their discontents and their fears, is through popular organization. And it goes all the way back here. Now, were your Daniel Shays, your Anti-Federalists, were they right to be scared? Were they right to be scared of this new US Constitution? Was this new US Constitution going to be used to oppress them? The Constitution clearly was counter-revolutionary in the sense of creating a stronger central government that would limit state and local authority moving forward. Clearly, that was the case. But the ratification of the US Constitution in 1788 also had kind of a trickle-down effect too. States that had created more democratic constitutions after 1788, they rewrote their constitutions. Pennsylvania is a great example of this. Pennsylvania, we've talked about their 1776 Constitution and how, even though they didn't use the term democracy, how democratic that government was, right? We talked about PA's 1776 Constitution. They write a new Constitution in 1790. After the new US Constitution goes into effect, Pennsylvanians create a new Constitution. Bicameral legislature, stronger executive, property qualifications for voting. Pennsylvanians who could vote in the 1780s, Pennsylvania guys who could vote in the 1780s, they can't vote in the 1790s. Their right to vote is taken away because of property qualifications for voting were added in under the new Constitution. I began this lecture ultimately back with Tom Paine complaining about the way that Americans had gone about developing their revolution after 1776. Paine was particularly upset with Pennsylvania. He was particularly upset with Pennsylvania's 1790 Constitution. He says, look, the Constitution that really reflected starting the world over, getting rid of aristocracy and monarchy, was the 1776 Constitution. That was the one that Paine had worked. And so for him to come back and to live, to see this new Constitution of 1790 that Pennsylvanians had drawn up, he's like, what the heck? You get scared? You're afraid of freedom? And he accuses the Americans of betraying their revolution because of what they did after 1788. Not only did they create this stronger central government over the states, but even at the state levels, several states went back on their initial desires to institute freedom. Another counter-revolutionary development was after 1788, the return of persons of wealth to political privilege. And I'll tell you just one story along these lines. A story that's until recently has been kind of hard to find. I've always, when I've looked it up, I've had a hard time finding it. There's a few more stories out there now, so we're getting better at telling this particular story. I think that Americans, we just like to cover this one up because it's just really bad, honestly. It's the Revolutionary War bond scandal. So remember that I said that guys like Daniel Shays were fighting in the Continental Army alongside George Washington. They got these IOUs, right? They got these promises of payment, but under the Articles of Confederation, they were never going to see any money. The Articles couldn't raise any money, so they were never going to pay off these IOUs. There were Americans at this time, and I've talked about them before, speculators. Speculators, look, there's no stock market in the 1780s. What there are there's land. So we talked about speculation in land. People like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, these guys speculated in land. In the 1780s, people with money start speculating in war bonds. Persons with wealth, persons with disposable income. Apparently, John Adams' wife, Abigail had asked John, we're going to talk about Abigail in a future lecture. Abigail had asked John, hey, could I go buy some, hey, everybody's buying up these war bonds from these farmers. Could I go, buy some up too? And John's like, no, it's kind of a seedy business. And Abigail went and bought some up anyways. So it's, it's even in our founding fathers' own circles. These guys are buying up the war bond. What they're doing is they go around to these farm communities. They send their agents, or sometimes they go themselves as, knock your door. Hey, heard you fought in the Revolutionary War. Thank you for your service. I know you got one of these war bonds. You got that nice IOU there. Uncle Sam's never going to pay that back, but I can give you some money right now for it. So you said yours is for $10. I'll give you $1. I'll give you $1 right now. You give me your IOU. And guess what war vet does? He sells his war bond, because what are the chances is this is ever going to get paid back? Right? Under the Articles of Confederation, it's not going to happen. And these guys, these Daniel Shays types, they need the money right away. Right? They're threatened with losing their homes. So they trade their war bonds. We don't know how extensive this practice was, but the guy who studied Pennsylvania during these years, he's estimated that as much as 80% of war bonds exchanged hands during the 1780s. So it's pretty significant. We have reason to believe that most war vets traded in their IOUs. Enter Alexander Hamilton. Yes.
What did they get out of it? Thinking that
What did he
they
do?
had hoped that they actually worked.
The speculators? That's the hope, right? Speculation is always buy low, sell high, right? Or always try, or buy cheap, sell expensive. So they're hoping that something's going to happen. Enter Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's going to be our first Secretary of the Treasury. You read in McClay's book about his funding program. Hamilton wants to take all the debts of all the colonies, consolidate them into one giant debt. Good move, but part of his plan says to George Washington and the rest of the cabinet, hey, he actually says this to some friends too, some friends who happen to be involved in speculating. You know what I'd really like to do is a show of good faith to those who fought on behalf of the American Revolution, which included Hamilton, who fought. I would like to pay those war bonds off at full value with 7 years interest. And Hamilton proposes, as a part of our funding program, and understand the new U.S. Constitution, it does have the power to tax. Hamilton says, hey, wouldn't it be great if we paid the war bonds off at full value with 7 years interest? You see what's happening, right? You see where this is heading. The soldiers have, before 1788, when Hamilton is proposing this, they've traded in their war bonds already. Who owns most of these war bonds now? Speculators, persons already of wealth and comfort, are going to, if Hamilton's plan works, they are going to receive a windfall of government money. They bought these things for fractions of what they were worth. They're going to get full value plus 7 years interest. And you're saying, man, there's no way. Like there's no way that like Hamilton and Congress, there's no way they knew that this had happened. They didn't. Why they did it. Why they did it. They debated in Congress. Knowing what we know about these war bonds, can we rightfully do this? Can we justifiably do this? Can we screw over war vets in this kind of way? And ultimately, Congress says, yes, we can. And they do. And the war bonds are paid off at full value with 7 years interest. You're telling me stories. It's so horrible. This actually happened. I'm not making this up. This actually happened. I know you like Alexander Hamilton from the musical and everything. You got to understand who this guy is. It's a guy who believed, in his words, that the rich should have a, quote, distinct permanent share in our government. One of the ways that he sought to build legitimacy for the new U.S. Constitution was to bring the wealthy on board. What better way to bring the wealthy on board is to show how the new U.S. Constitution and its taxing power could increase the wealth of the wealthy. And so he does. Hamilton, his friends, even the families of the people we call our founding fathers received windfalls of government money at the expense of the soldiers who actually did the fighting in the American Revolution. Now, in 1808, there was a recognition that a grave injustice had been done to war vets, and there was an attempt to find them and to give them some money. Too little, too late by 1808. Like I said, we used to have enough history majors and enough interest that I could teach a course in the American Revolution. And we read a autobiography in there, Private Yankee Doodle. It's about one of these guys who served in the one of these guys who served in the Continental Army, and he goes through in painstaking detail. It talks about how horrible it was. I mean, they're eating shoes at one point. You just put something in their stomach. They're eating their shoes. It's unbelievable what these guys went through, and almost all of them had lasting mental and physical issues because of their service in the war. But they don't get their 10 bucks. Most of them don't get. Private Yankee Doodle, he struggles throughout his life. He gets a little bit of money in 1808. There's another attempt in the 1820s to some of these guys like Private Yankee, they're still around. And some Americans are like, man, these are war vets. They fought for a revolution. Shouldn't we do something to help them out? And then there are a bunch of other Americans who are saying, losers, why can't they get their act together? Why can't they take care of themselves? And so, you know, he writes his story in the 1820s to say, this is why I can't take care of myself. This is what happened to me when I fought this revolution. And I never got paid. And you're here, you know, debating So I think it's helpful. We rightfully have conversations today about how we fall short of treating our war vets, how we need to be supporting them better. But I think we are in a much better place than we were in the founding years of our country, when we literally used the power of the new federal government to rip these guys off. So as I said, the new U.S. Constitution created a counter-revolutionary movement with new state governments that limited political rights and freedoms for Americans, new policies that saw an attempt to kind of restore the old order of where persons of wealth had more political influence and more political say within the United States. I mean, that is what the original Federalists, largely, in your Hamiltons, your Washingtons, even your John Adams, that's the kind of America they wanted to see restored. And they even were willing to rip off war vets to be able to try to bring that vision of a restored aristocratic America, or at least a more elitist Republican America about. It was a time of counter-revolution. We might not remember it that way, but you got to trust me on this. The majority of Americans felt this time as a time of counter-revolution. They felt this time. I know a lot of students. I know a lot of Americans who feel like we're losing our freedoms today. There's different things going on. We're losing our freedoms. You know now how majority of Americans felt during this time. They didn't welcome this new government as somehow securing their freedoms. They welcomed this new government as potentially taking their freedoms away. And they could point to things like Alexander Hamilton's funding program as evidence that that's what was going to happen. But if this was a time of counter-revolution, I would say it was also a time of failed counter-revolution. What I'm saying is that the U.S. Constitution ultimately failed in its most fundamental goal. Edwards, how can you say the U.S. Constitution? How could you say that? What's the original purpose, that whole preamble thing? What's the primary purpose of the new U.S. Constitution? To create a more perfect union, right? What evidence would Edwards look at to suggest, that more perfect union, it doesn't really come about, at least not quite so early? What evidence might Edwards look at to say, yeah, more perfect union doesn't really come about? Well, yeah, I guess I shouldn't move to that slide. The Civil War, right? The Civil War, and we'll talk about the Civil War as a second American Revolution, trying to resolve the issues left unresolved by the first revolution, right? Why do I say the Constitution was ultimately a failed counter-revolution? It's because it ultimately cannot hold the country together. We'll see how Americans constantly threaten each other with disunion in the 60 years after the ratification of our Constitution, until finally in the 1860s, this union literally takes place, the Civil War. But there were warning signs before that, and this is kind of our final subject for section 2 of this course. The Whiskey Rebellion, or some historians call it the Whiskey Regulation. And some historians would call this the last of the regulator movements of this era, right? Regulator movements began in North Carolina in the 1760s, are still taking place because the conditions haven't changed. They're still taking place. They were in North Carolina in the 1760s. They were in Massachusetts in the 1780s. Now they're in Pennsylvania in the 1790s. What's going on among farmers? Look, most Pennsylvanians are farmers. What's going on in Pennsylvania in the 1790s among farmers? Same thing that had been going on among farmers in Massachusetts in the 1780s, been going on among farmers in North Carolina in the 1760s. They're being taxed. They're being asked to pay their tax in silver and gold. They can't pay their tax in silver and gold. There isn't silver and gold in their communities to pay their taxes, and so they're losing their property. Farm foreclosures were skyrocketing in Pennsylvania in the 1780s. The creation of a new US Constitution, the creation of a new Constitution for Pennsylvania did not do anything to change that. Farmers are still feeling threatened in the 1790s. So now they're being asked to pay or asked to reckon with a new tax, a whiskey tax. We've talked about the whiskey tax in here before. Joseph Parker and his people opposing whiskey tax passed by Pennsylvania's legislature. Now in the 1790s, we're talking about a national tax on whiskey. Look, this is what the new US Constitution can do. It can impose taxes, it has tax power. So Hamilton in 1791 says, look, we want to take on this debt. We want to pay IOUs off at full value with 7 years interest. We need to raise money somewhere to be able to do it. I know. Why don't we tax whiskey? Whiskey is a class tax. Guess who doesn't drink whiskey? Look, if Alexander Hamilton drank whiskey, he would not be imposing a tax on him. He doesn't drink whiskey. The poor drink whiskey. They drink the whiskey that is made by Pennsylvania farmers. We're primarily grain farmers who, to diversify their income, turn their excess grain into whiskey. A tax on whiskey is going to fall heavily on the poor, and it's going to fall on farmers. This was true in the 1770s. It's still true in the 1790s. So Pennsylvanians are already under difficult circumstances. They're already freaked out about this new constitution. One of the reasons that we call what's going on in Pennsylvania the regulation, one of the reasons it's right to do so, guess who's one of the leaders in Pennsylvania during this time? Remember Herman Husband, who led the North Carolina regulators? Herman Husband has been hanging out in Pennsylvania since the 1780s. He was there organizing opposition to the new US Constitution. Now in the 1790s, is organizing farmer opposition to the whiskey tax. Farmers begin doing after 1791 exactly what farmers had done in Massachusetts in the 1780s, North Carolina in the 1760s. They begin engaging in acts of civil disobedience to try to stop the destruction of their way of life. Things get so bad in Pennsylvania, they don't go as far as Vermont, right? Vermont, president of Vermont, it was New York. And the people who made up Vermont, they were so sick of New York that they left and we're going to make our own state. They made Vermont. The people of Western Pennsylvania around 1792, they were so fed up with the eastern side of the state, the Philadelphia people, the wealthy people. They literally tried to cut the state in half. All these roads that ran from east to west, they put up barriers. They rolled stones, they put up trees and made fences, everything. They literally tried to wall off Western Pennsylvania from the eastern side. They're trying to shut it off, to try to shut down what they saw as the destruction of their way of life. Whiskey regulation comes to a head in 1794 at Braddock's Field outside of Pittsburgh. an estimated 7,000 Pennsylvanians gather at Braddock's Field to try to decide. They've done this before. 4,000 had gathered in Philly to try to decide, hey, what do we want? And they ultimately decided they wanted independence from England. It was back in 1776. Now in 1794, 7,000 Pennsylvanians get together at Braddock's Field and say, they're trying to figure out what we want. And they're kind of divided. There is an attempted march on Pittsburgh to try to shut down foreclosures there. But for others, they just wanted to be done with the new union altogether. Some observers heard chants coming up from the crowd for secession. Now, we're used to secession coming in 1861 when South Carolina led a jailbreak from the United States. The first secession movement facing the United States actually occurred in 1794 at Braddock's Field. As some Pennsylvanians so fed up with the things that always tick Americans off, an oppressive tax system and an unresponsive government, that they're talking about seceding from the unions. Now, this doesn't happen. Why is that? Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. When Boston threw a bunch of tea into the harbor in 1773, what did the king do? Militarily occupied Boston. When Pennsylvanians threatened to march on Pittsburgh or to leave the Union, what does George Washington do? He sends 15,000 troops through Western Pennsylvania, himself leading this movement of extraordinary military force. And there is no whiskey regulation anymore. Now, it's been an overkill. I mean, I'd like to think that George Washington could probably ride through Western Pennsylvania himself and put down a regulation. Who wants to be the person who says, yeah, I knocked George Washington off his horse. Yeah, father of our country, totally killed him, right? Nobody wants to be that guy. So I'd like to think that Washington probably could have put this down himself, but he decided to take 15,000 of his buddies. Guess what? He can do that now. Under the Articles of Confederation, you can't raise an army. The government can't raise an army. Under the US Constitution, you can. In Washington, sensing another Shays Rebellion kind of getting out of hand, wants to put an end to it once and for all. And there'll be another kind of uprising, a smaller uprising in Pennsylvania, 1799. But for all intents and purposes, the whiskey regulation of 1794 is the last of the regulator movements. It's the end. And it's because we have a federal government now, which can mobilize such extraordinary force against its own people. Can you use the U.S. military to put down a domestic protest? We were debating that in the past year. There's talk in Washington of wanting to use the U.S. military to break up Black Lives Matter, and it's like, can't really use the U.S. military. There's certain boundaries. The U.S. military, unless you declare an insurrection has taken place, you can't use the U.S. military to occupy U.S. territory, right? That's a violation of the Constitution. And so it's one of those debates in constitutional history. Did George Washington actually violate the U.S. Constitution? Because I don't know that he declared an actual insurrection was taking place in Pennsylvania, but he did certainly show off this extraordinary power of the federal government. So why am I saying that this is a failure? Because it seems like this is the first great victory for the U.S. Constitution. It shows what a stronger central government can do. It can put down domestic protests, or insurrections, whatever you want to call the Whiskey Regulation. Why am I calling it a failure? Look, if the only way that you can hold your country together is through shows of extraordinary military force, you're not much of a country, do you? If the only way you can keep your roommate from not leaving you is through putting armed guards in front of the door so they literally can't, and windows so they literally can't leave. Are you going to say, I have a great relationship with my roommate? No. You're coerced, that's not good, right? The Whiskey Regulation stands out as, hey, that more perfect union, it ain't happening. Americans are not figuring out how to work through their differences in peaceful kind of ways. The only way we're holding this country together is through threats or shows of extraordinary military force. Of course, the ultimate coming in 1861 with the Civil War. So thanks. See you next Tuesday. I'll see your papers before then, but I'll see you next Tuesday when we begin reviewing for midterm number 2.
Next day.